Of all we must endure in the service of our health, is there anything worse than going to the dentist? According to polls, around 36% of Americans fear the dentist's office, with around 12% suffering from extreme dentophobia. And can you blame them? Even a regular checkup involves a dentist poking around your mouth with sharp instruments and pouring in various nasty liquids. And should they find a cavity or some other problem, then you face the tedious, uncomfortable, or even painful ordeal of getting a filling, a root canal, or even more serious surgery. But as unpleasant as all of this is, at least your dentist has your best interests at heart. Imagine if instead of keeping your teeth clean and healthy, they instead watched and did nothing as your teeth slowly and painfully turned black and rotted away. Horrifyingly, in the 1940s, a group of Swedish scientists did just that. Between 1945 and 1949, these researchers fed a group of intellectually disabled hospital patients massive quantities of sugar and watched their teeth decay in order to find out the root cause of dental cavities. While the study collected much useful data on oral health still used to this day, it violated nearly every rule of medical ethics and left hundreds of vulnerable people in terrible pain. This is the sad story of the Vipeholm experiments. Our story begins in the mid-1930s, when a study conducted by the Swedish Board of Health revealed the abysmal state of the nation's oral health. The study found, among other things, that a whopping 83% of Swedish children developed dental cavities by the age of 3. Indeed, during this period, dental health was poor all around the world, and rotten teeth were typically pulled rather than fixed, leaving many adults with mouths full of missing teeth. The problem was so bad that during the First and Second World Wars, the United States Armed Forces required recruits to have at least 3 intact pairs of opposing teeth. In response to this growing crisis, in 1938, the Swedish Parliament established the Public Dental Service, requiring municipalities to provide dental care to their citizens. However, it soon became clear that there were nowhere near enough dentists to keep up with demand, so the Swedish government switched to prevention-based dental healthcare to make optimal use of the national resources. But there was a problem. At the time, nobody actually knew what caused dental cavities to form. As a medical report from the period explained, quote, "Studies hitherto available had not provided a definitive answer to such basic questions as to whether dental caries should be regarded as the expression of a disturbance of the general condition of the patient, e.g. a deficiency disease, or whether it was due to local oral factors related to the diet." End quote. Some doctors posited that cavities were caused by a deficiency of vitamins like A, C, or D, while others suspected that consumption of large quantities of sugar and other carbohydrates were to blame. The latter hypothesis appeared to be supported by empirical observations. Children in orphanages, who could not afford to eat sweets very often, developed cavities at rates far lower than the rest of the Swedish population. And during the Second World War, in which Sweden remained neutral, severe sugar rationing in countries like the UK was accompanied by a dramatic improvement in overall oral health. But without hard experimental data, it would be difficult to implement a national dental health policy. The Swedish government thus asked the medical board, quote, "to perform in collaboration with the board of the dental school a general investigation concerning what measures should be taken to decrease the frequency of the most common dental diseases in Sweden." The study, launched in 1945, was funded by the Swedish sugar industry, who were eager to determine and hopefully discount the role of their product in the nation's oral health. The more things change. And this is where our story gets very, very dark very, very quickly. For the venue the dental school chose for its experiments was the Vipeholm Mental Hospital outside of Lund in Sweden. In 1935, the facility had been converted into a home for people with severe intellectual disabilities who were transferred from other state hospitals and regional psychiatric wards. By the mid-1940s, the hospital housed more than 1,000 patients, their ages ranging from 15 to 70. As covered in our previous video, the incredibly dark origins of the terms idiot, imbecile, and moron. Initially, these terms were not mere playground insults, but official medical terminology strongly associated with the eugenics movement of the early 20th century. Coined by American psychologist Henry H. Goddard, moron referred to someone with an IQ of 51 to 70, the equivalent of a normal 12-year-old child, imbecile, an IQ of 26 to 50, and an idiot, an IQ under 25. The term cretin was also commonly used to refer to those suffering from congenital iodine deficiency syndrome, then known as cretinism. At Vipeholm, physician Dr. Hugo Frodeberg developed his own intelligence ranking system, classifying patients on a scale from 0 to 6. According to Swedish journalist Thomas Kanger, Frodeberg rated the 0 group as biologically lower standing than most animal species, considering them vegetables. He thought groups 1 to 3 may have a certain spiritual life, but were otherwise unimaginable. A full 2/3 of the patients at Vipeholm fell into the first 4 intelligence categories: deemed uneducatable by the medical board. Many could not dress or feed themselves. For these forgotten souls, life at Vipeholm was bleak. Most spend their days and nights unattended in large communal dormitory halls with no activities to occupy their time. The only private sleeping space was a solitary confinement cell where troublesome patients were tied to a bed bolted to the floor. Others were dunked in ice water baths to correct their behavior. At mealtimes, patients were not allowed knives or forks, only spoons. But for the researchers from the dental school, Vipeholm was an ideal research environment, housing a permanent population of test subjects in a fully controlled environment who could be made to eat prescribed meals at set intervals and closely monitored over a long period of time. If the idea of experimenting on people with severe intellectual disabilities who most certainly cannot provide informed consent sounds horribly unethical, sadly, this was not the attitude at the time. As Art Kaplan, founding director of the Division of Medical Ethics at New York University Langone Medical Center, explains, quote, "Anyone with disabilities were seen as not fully human at the time, so they had fewer rights. They were also seen as owing the state for their care. The attitude was, we're taking care of you, so you have an obligation back to the community. And one way to discharge that debt is by being in this kind of experiment." Such rationales were used to justify many unethical human experiments in the mid-20th century, including one 1950s study where researchers from Quaker Oats and MIT fed teenage residents of the Walter E. Ferdinand State School in Massachusetts oatmeal laced with radioactive traces to study the nutritional benefits of different breakfast cereals. And for more on that horrifying story, please check out our previous video, The Time Quaker Oats Fed Orphans Radioactive Oatmeal for Reasons. For the study, the dental school researchers chose 660 patients from the upper 4 levels of Dr. Frodeberg's intelligence scale. Those at the lower levels could not feed themselves and tended to swallow their food without chewing and were thus rejected. The subjects were divided into 2 groups, a study and a control group, and their teeth closely examined. Their oral health was found to be better overall than the general Swedish population, likely because their diet contained significantly less sugar. The study itself was divided into 3 phases. In the first phase, which began in 1945, the subjects were fed meals containing minimal starch and half the sugar of the typical Swedish diet. No eating was permitted between regular meals to avoid contaminating the results. The patients were also given supplements of vitamin A, C, and D, as well as fluoride tablets. The latter were intended to replicate the research of United States National Institutes of Health researcher Henry Trendley Dean, who in 1945 determined that adding as little as 1 milligram per liter of fluoride to the drinking water supply significantly reduced cavities while producing no negative secondary effects. This phase of the study lasted 2 years, at the end of which the researchers observed that 78% of the test subjects had developed no new cavities. But while this was strong evidence that sugar and starches were responsible for cavity formation, the researchers wanted to be absolutely sure, and in 1947 the study entered its second, far more disturbing phase. The test subjects were divided into 3 groups, who were fed 4 meals a day containing elevated levels of sugar. Group 1 ate sticky bread made with extra sugar. Group 2 drank beverages laced with 1.5 cups of sugar, while Group 3 ate chocolate and toffees specially formulated by the confectionery industry, who, remember, were funding the research to stick to the teeth. Group 3 was further divided into 2 subgroups, given either 8 or 24 pieces of toffee to eat per meal. Initially, the staff at Vipeholm were also included in the study, but they soon dropped since it was impossible to regulate and monitor their sugar intake. While the patients in Groups 1 and 2 suffered relatively few ill effects from their sweetened diets, those in Group 3 suffered horribly. Though the official report clinically stated that the tooth decay was high in groups which received sugar in sticky form between meals. In the control, sucrose, and bread groups, the activity was still low and of the same order as during the vitamin study. End quote. According to Thomas Kanga, quoting again, "The teeth were destroyed. I've seen dental records of this. Every tooth was black. I'm talking about every tooth damaged, and it went on for years. And after they were ruined, these people were in terrible pain. It was actually horrible." End quote. Indeed, by the time Phase 2 ended in 1949, 50 of the 660 subjects developed entire mouthfuls of black, rotten teeth. According to the final report, at the start of the study, the patients, who had previously received almost no dental care, had a combined total of 11,238 unfilled cavities. By the end of the study, this number had increased to 13,363. Even worse, not only did the researchers not intervene to fix the patients' teeth during the trial, but they often failed to help them afterwards. According to Thomas Kanga, quoting again, "Those who could not cooperate with the fixing procedures, like being scared of the drill, were not treated. They also chose not to fix the teeth among many of the lower categories of patients." Those in the higher categories who did cooperate were treated, but often their cavity-riddled teeth were simply pulled out rather than being drilled and filled. The third and final phase of the study began in 1949, involving feeding the patients a more typical diet of high carbohydrates. But then the damage had already been done. Scientifically speaking, the experiments were hugely successful, definitively linking dental cavities, or caries as they are more properly termed, to high sugar consumption. The researchers observed a slow but measurable increase in body weight and a rapid increase in dental cavities over the course of the study, both of which slowed and eventually halted when the test subjects were reverted to their pre-study diet. Today, we know that caries are caused by bacteria, which feed off of sugars and other carbohydrates, producing lactic acid, which eats away at the dental enamel. These findings changed the face of oral health around the world, inspiring the development of artificial sweeteners like aspartame, placing greater emphasis on toothbrushing and other oral healthcare practices, and spurring municipalities around the world to fluoridate their water supplies as a prophylactic measure. As you can imagine, the sugar industry was none too pleased with the findings of the Vipeholm experiments, and following the partial publication of the final report in 1952, withdrew their financial support, preventing follow-up studies from being conducted. The researchers turned to the government for additional funds, but in 1954, the Swedish parliament, recognizing the unethical nature of the previous studies, passed a bill prohibiting further research from being performed on the patients at Vipeholm. What makes the Vipeholm experiments especially egregious is that in 1947, the same year that the destructive second phase of the study began, the Council for War Crimes in Germany established the Nuremberg Code. Drafted in response to the horrific medical experiments conducted by Nazi researchers during the Second World War, the code established ethical guidelines for human experimentation, stating, among other things, quote, "The voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential. This means that the person involved should have legal capacity to give consent, should be so situated as to be able to exercise free power of choice without the intervention of any element of force, fraud, deceit, duress, overreaching, or other ulterior form of constraint or coercion, and should have sufficient knowledge and comprehension of the elements of the subject matter involved as to enable him to make an understanding and enlightened decision, and that during the course of the experiment, the scientists in charge must be prepared to terminate the experiment at any stage if he has probable cause to believe, in the exercise of good faith, superior skill, and careful judgment required of him, that a continuation of the experiment is likely to result in injury, disability, or death to the experimental subject." End quote. These principles were further expanded upon by the 1964 Declaration of Helsinki, which states in part, "It is the duty of the physician to promote and safeguard the health, well-being, and rights of patients, including those who are involved in medical research. The physician's knowledge and conscience are dedicated to the fulfillment of this duty. While the primary duty of medical research is to generate new knowledge, this goal can never take precedence over the rights and interests of individual research subjects. Some groups and individuals are particularly vulnerable and may have an increased likelihood of being wronged or of incurring additional harm. All vulnerable groups and individuals should receive specifically considered protection." End quote. As you may have noticed, the Vipeholm experiments violated every single one of these guidelines, particularly the fundamental ethical principles of beneficence, justice, and respect. Nonetheless, many researchers involved in the study continued to defend their methods. Professor Bo Kras, for instance, disputes the grotesque scene painted by commentators like Thomas Kranger, writing in 1989 article that, "While it is obvious that a research ethics committee would not accept a project like the Vipeholm study today, we dentists did not see any ethical problems with the study itself. Many of the new cavities which developed during the carbohydrate periods were only early enamel lesions which today are remineralized by topical fluoride application." End quote. Other researchers argue that while the experiments did inflict harm on the test subjects, this was far outweighed by the health benefits to the Swedish population and the world at large. Similar arguments have been used in more recent times to justify the continued use of data from certain Nazi human experiments, particularly those of SS Dr. Sigmund Rasche, whose work produced the only existing data on the effects of hypothermia on the human body. And for more on these chilling experiments, please do check out our previous video, The Nazi Experiments, whose results are still being used by medical scientists today. It's also important to recognize the era and climate in which the studies took place. As previously mentioned, at the time, the mentally disabled were seen as effectively subhuman, and experimenting on them was seen as perfectly reasonable. Indeed, when the report of the Vipeholm experiments was finally published in full, the public uproar that emerged over the involvement of the sugar and confectionery industries, not the ethics of the experiments themselves, were the problem. Nor were the Vipeholm experiments the only or the worst abuses perpetrated by the Swedish government. Between 1941 and 1943, around 200 patients at Vipeholm starved to death, largely due to neglect because of staff shortages. And throughout the 1940s and 50s, many homosexuals were lobotomized against their will in Swedish psychiatric hospitals, homosexuality being considered a mental illness requiring treatment. This was also the early Cold War period, when the security and survival of the nation trumped all other considerations and was used to justify all manner of unethical behavior. For example, as we covered in our 2-hour documentary Swept Under the Rug, The Truth About the Japanese Holocaust, many of the doctors who ran Imperial Japan's infamous Unit 731, who tested biological and chemical weapons on human beings, were pardoned by the United States in exchange for their valuable data, and in some cases given money in exchange for it as well. And the United States government itself conducted many unethical experiments on its own citizens without their consent, including injecting terminal cancer patients with plutonium, spraying entire American cities with bacteria, and the infamous MK-Ultra mind control studies. Erin Bominell, a history and ethics researcher at Sweden's Linköping University and the first to obtain and study the original records of the Vipeholm experiments, neatly sums up the strange ethical, scientific, and political position occupied by the study, quoting, "While science had to profile itself as being shielded from political interests in order to be credible, it was not objective in practice. It is part of politics and society." This was politically commissioned research. In scientific terms, the results were sound, and they were politically useful. The Vipeholm researchers' findings still hold up. In fact, we have them to thank for the excellent dental health that Swedes now enjoy. The price was paid by the patients with rotten teeth. End quote. Indeed, in 1957, the Swedish government launched a massive public health campaign aimed at reducing tooth decay. Through public service announcements on the radio, posters at school, and pamphlets delivered in the mail, the government urged Swedish children to brush their teeth regularly and cut down on sweets, especially between meals. The campaign slogan of "all the sweets you like, but only once a week" birthed the beloved Swedish tradition of Lord Dag Sagodis, or Saturday candy, still eagerly anticipated by Swedish children to this day. Thanks to this culture of moderation, Sweden has become one of the greatest per capita consumer of candy, whilst paradoxically maintaining one of the highest levels of oral health in the world. But it is doubtful many sweet-toothed Swedes are aware that they owe this enviable health record and their beloved confectionery traditions to the exploitation and suffering of 660 psychiatric patients.